This week on the Wheelhouse, criminal justice reform. And a little later, mayoral races. For Connecticut Public Radio, I'm Frankie Graziano. This is the Wheelhouse. It's a show that connects politics to the people. We got your weekly dose of politics in Connecticut and beyond. Right here. And we start today's show with a look at criminal justice reform in the state. This legislative session, we've seen a number of proposals dealing with everything from deceptive police tactics to voting while incarcerated. And I got a great panel with me here today to talk about it. Here to break it all down are Jaden Edison, justice reporter for the Connecticut Mirror, and he's going to be working today, so look forward to seeing some of his work at ctmirror.org. Good morning, Jaden.
Good morning. How you doing? Thanks for having me.
I'm doing well. Thank you for coming by, and very excited to talk to you for the first time on my show, Mercy Quay, the founder of the Narrative Project and the editor of CT Mirror's Community Editorial Board. You've also heard her on the podcast Untold. Good morning, Mercy.
Good morning, Frankie. Happy to be here.
And then finally, James Foreman, Jr., professor at the Yale Law School, faculty director, Yale Law and Racial Justice Center. Good morning, James.
Good morning. Good to be with y'all.
Thank you so much for coming on, James. And if anybody wants to join in on this conversation, do give us a call today, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR, the number to call if you want to join us. Mercy gets the first question before we sort of get into the nitty-gritty of the bills in the session. I got to ask, how's Connecticut overall when it comes to criminal justice, Mercy? What do you think?
You know, if I had to give Connecticut a grade, I'd say maybe a C plus, B minus. I think that what's happening in our state right now, we are asking the right questions up at session. We are putting forth the right bills. We are thinking critically, but I think at the same time, when there are arguments about whether police officers should be able to have access to lying for deceptive police tactics, or when we are looking at criminal, the way that New Haven police officers handled the Randy Cox situation, when we look at SROs in schools, when we look at the way that we are handling mental health situations, I think that overall, if I had to give it a grade, we're looking at it as C plus, B minus. There is a lot of opportunity for improvement, but at the same time, if folks were to tell you that we are not on the up and up, crime is down in our state now compared to the last 10 years. And when we look at those numbers, we know that something is working, but we have a long way to go.
Mercy's been reporting on this in the state for over 10 years now, I think, or 10 years, something like that. And something you covered back in 2019, I kind of want to pay attention to because I'm understanding your grade and seeing kind of the background of why these kind of things come up where all of a sudden it's like, why are we talking about deceptive tactics and policing? This seems like something that should have come up a while ago, right? So you talked about the way this was specifically about prison population, but I think it's important to underscore the second point. You talk about investing in the community and being culturally conscious as a culture to, quote, address the inappropriate perception of crime in people of color and individuals from low-income backgrounds. And I think that now that we think more of how our policies impact people, mainly people of color, that's kind of like why maybe this stuff is starting to come up now. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, something that I said in that line specifically is the perception of criminality, right? I think oftentimes we perceive people of color in their neighborhoods doing regular things as criminal behavior, sitting on porches in the summer because they might not have AC in the back, or groups of young kids hanging out in parks. We perceive these actions as criminal behavior. And the reality of it is it's just not, right? But having a sense of cultural consciousness means looking at the various behaviors of communities you might not be a part of and figuring out, what is there actually a crime being committed here, or am I uncomfortable because I'm unaware of the way certain communities might behave. And so the perception really matters. I think we have the same perception when it comes to young people, in large groups together, and how they might be scary to some people. But I think when it comes down to it, young people are a young person, a group of young people in New Haven that are, melanated might be doing the same thing as a group of young people in Branford. But the way that we perceive those two actions really comes down to the way we perceive race.
James, I want you to jump in here. Your thoughts on what Mercy's talking about, and if you can, then give us kind of a barometer of where Connecticut is compared to other states in the country.
I think what Mercy's saying makes a lot of sense. I think the thing about Connecticut, and the reason why B minus, C plus, where she put it, seems about right, is that by certain measures, Connecticut is doing well, which is to say, Connecticut has the ninth lowest incarceration rate of any state in the country. So that's good. Connecticut has also shown, and this has really been led by leadership at the local level and grassroots organization. Connecticut has shown that you can reduce your prison rate and reduce crime at the same time. So between 2000 and 2020, Connecticut has seen over a 25% reduction in the prison rate while crime continues to over that period of time decline, which is an important response to people who say, if you reduce the prison rate, crime is going to go up. So those are all things that are really, really good. On the other hand, Connecticut still, by international standards, has a very high incarceration rate. Connecticut has one of the greatest black-white disparities in incarceration rates. And really what Mercy said that kind of gets to the bottom of it when she was talking about, why are we still having a conversation about whether or not you can lie to young people, is that underneath those numbers that I gave you, there are individual people. And underneath those numbers, what we see is that there's just a lot of inhumanity in the system. There's a lot of lack of caring in the system. There's a lot of treating people as disposable in the system. And those are the things that I think are really, to me, the challenge of the next decade.
Amazing context there, James. Thank you for providing it. And really, James and Mercy are talking about how criminal justice is being tackled in Connecticut. But I want to know what the folks out there listening, what they think, their thoughts on how lawmakers are tackling criminal justice in our state. You can tell us by calling us at 888-720-9677, 888-720-WNPR. Jaden Edison, you've been covering all things juvenile and criminal justice this session as the Justice King and Equity King here in the state of Connecticut. There's a lot to get through, but let's start with the bill aimed at expanding the vote for incarcerated people. Lawmakers hearing testimony this year on enfranchising all incarcerated Connecticut residents. But will it actually happen, Jaden?
Yeah, so it's an interesting subject, and I think it's timely, right? So I guess to answer the simple question is you had two bills around this, two House bills around extending the franchise to all people who are incarcerated, both of which receive what they call subject matter public hearings. So these bills didn't receive votes outside of the committee. So what it did, though, is it allowed lawmakers to hear more about this concept, from the public, and it opened the door for perhaps in future years what could be, landmark legislation in Connecticut, right? I think, currently the only people who are incarcerated who can vote are people who are detained pretrial and people with misdemeanors. And so people with felonies essentially can't vote. And so when you look at the momentum over the last several years, right? I mean, even going back before that, right? In the early 2000s, you have Connecticut allows people who are on probation to vote. And then the last couple of years, you've seen the outlawing of prison gerrymandering, which is widely known as a discriminatory practice, right? That counts incarcerated people as part of the towns in which they are incarcerated and not where they are actually from. So that was outlawed in Connecticut. And then you've also seen the franchise extended to people who are on parole, which Connecticut was the last state to make that distinction between people on probation and parole. So when you talk to people who are working in the space, extending the franchise to all people who are incarcerated is what they call the logical next step. And so the history also is very fascinating. I mean, we've already heard Mercy and James allude to this a bit, though, when you talk about the criminalization of everyday activity historically of Black and brown people. I mean, you can go as far back as Black codes, right, which criminalize people for not having, jobs or being homeless, etc. And then you look at the era of mass incarceration, which we know the war on drugs was a manufactured crisis, right, that led overwhelmingly, to the disparities that we see today in our criminal legal system. So all in all, this isn't maybe something that we're going to see this year, but with the momentum that has, I guess, been garnered in this space in particular, this is definitely something to watch out in the future years. Because as we know, in Connecticut, it's the land of steady habits, and lawmakers like to do things incrementally. But the fact that these receive these public hearings, and also, again, this isn't the first year that this bill has sort of surfaced, but it's also showing you that perhaps this is something that some lawmakers and especially community organizers are adamant about, and something that they're really pushing to get done, hopefully much sooner rather than later.
And go off of Jaden if you can, Mercy, if you could jump in first. And then, James, I want to hear from you on this and why it's important to give incarcerated persons the right to vote.
I mean, so one of the biggest things that we know is that police activity is heightened in communities of color, which means that arrests are going to be heightened in communities of color, which means that prison populations are going to feature people of color far more than their white counterparts. And so when we look at the area of mass incarceration, when we look at the manufactured crisis of the war on drugs, what we know is that these were specific targets on communities of color, Black, brown, low-income communities. And so when our prisons are filled with individuals who identify as Black, brown, or low income, what it means is that there's this continuous disenfranchisement of individuals who come from these communities, which means that there won't be a voice coming from communities about who represents them on a basic level or what policies govern them, right? I think when it comes down to it, these are practices that are as bad as gerrymandering. These are practices as bad as strip searches. I think these are practices that really look at a community and say, what are the ways we can disempower them? And we know that mass incarceration is one of the ways that Black and brown communities have been impacted for generation over generation, complete communities decimated by the war on drugs. And so when we see things like the legalization of marijuana, when we see things like the clean slate bill being enacted for people to get certain convictions erased from their records, we see moments in our society here in Connecticut where we're trying to make strides towards justice. If we are trying to do that in earnest, what we need to do is give those who are imprisoned, those who are jailed, return their access to voting. Anything else was going to be unjust.
And James, just follow up on Mercy here. Who do you think is? We're talking about low-level criminal offenses, I would imagine, where people are being arrested and thrown in jail for a long time and during the war of drugs for low-level marijuana offenses, things like that. Who's being hit hardest by this inability to vote while incarcerated?
Well, I think here's the way I would think about the question of voting while incarcerated, which is, what is it that we are hoping to do in our prison system? What is the purpose that prisons are supposed to serve? So I think that prisons are for people for a period of time who have shown that they pose some threat to public safety, or perhaps under some theories would need to be punished for a period of time. Okay, that's one vision of prison. Another vision of prison is that you want to create sites of degradation and inhumanity because your goal is to destroy people and create a permanent outcast system. And that's not a vision. That second vision is not one that I subscribe to. If you have the first vision, if you understand prison as a moment where somebody needs to go to be punished or to be isolated for a period of time, then you understand that those people are still coming home. We want them to come home. They're going to become part of our communities once again. And if that's your vision of prison, then you have to say, how do we create the conditions inside those prisons so that those people are going to be best positioned to return to our communities and return to our societies and make a contribution, get jobs, find housing, reconnect to their families. And if that's your vision, if that's your goal of what prisons are supposed to do, then it would be natural for you to look for ways to keep people connected to society while they're incarcerated. And one of the ways of remaining connected is by remaining connected to the franchise, by remaining connected to government. And the vote is essential to that. So really, I think it comes down to, what do we want our prisons to be? And once you know that, the answer to questions like voting become clear.
We got our first caller into the line today on the Wheelhouse, calling us at 888-720-9677. It's Yoni from Woodbridge. Tell us who you are, Yoni, and what your question is.
Hi, good morning. I'm an attorney. I'm a legal aid attorney, actually, in New Haven, and I also co-teach a law school reentry clinic. And so my primary practice is to defend from evictions, right? Individuals and families who are facing eviction. And in terms of this, this perspective of giving individuals who have been incarcerated, who are currently incarcerated, and I appreciate this thoughtful discussion because it's informing the things that I'm going to teach my students. I guess the question is, I'm coming at this from the perspective of somebody who's been practicing here for about a decade and looking at how Connecticut does things as this discussion has done. But my hope is that, and my question is, what are we going to do for the future? Because I have so many clients and I meet so many people who need my help, who have experienced incarceration or have come in contact with the justice system. And despite the advances like clean slate and hopefully we're going to have an ID law, an actual law that says that when you come out of incarceration, you're given a proper state ID. Things like that are a big step. I think voting would be a huge step as well.
And Yoni, you must be reading our mind, because that's going to be a great transition into our next question, because we're going to ask Jaden about voter IDs and keeping kind of current with what you want to know. We'll ask Jaden too some more about what the future holds. Thank you for calling in today, Yoni. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Jaden, go ahead. We're talking about IDs. This gentleman, Yoni, just really wants to know what's going to be done in the future here to button up our reform on criminal justice.
Yeah, so I would say I think he'll probably be happy with what has happened thus far in the legislature, right? So you have a bill that was passed out of committee that addresses this very thing. So I think before we get to the current, right, you have to understand how we got here. So, I mean, there was a law passed in 2017, right, that mandated the Department of Correction to work with the Department of Motor Vehicles to provide state IDs or driver's licenses. In particular, right, I think it's important to emphasize those two things: formal identification cards or driver's license to people who are returning home from incarceration, just as long as the person requested the identification, qualified for it, and would pay the fees associated with it, right? Well, what we're seeing is that there are, scores of people who are leaving incarceration at the moment who don't have those very forms of identification as mandated by the law. And I think over the last few weeks, you have seen the Department of Correction Commissioner Angel Quiros being questioned, and in many ways, the department being condemned by lawmakers who are flat out, I think, made very clear in the public hearing, upset that this isn't getting done. And so what you're seeing is legislation at the moment passed out of committee just last week that would fix some of those loopholes. So what the new law would do, that's already on the books, right? And just remember, this was something that lawmakers had already thought was addressed. But what this would do is, this new law would essentially mandate that now the department has to pay the fees associated with getting the identification. And everyone who's being who's being released back into their communities are able to get the identification unless in writing they indicate that they don't want that card or license. And also it would mandate the Department of Correction to annually provide statistics on how many IDs are being issued, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think this is a very important step, because when we talk about the Department of Correction being about rehabilitation and being about reducing recidivism, all these things, you would think the idea is one of the most basic forms of anything that you need to navigate life. I mean, to open a bank account. I mean, to do anything to attain a job. I mean, you need that basic form of identification to be able to do those things. And so I think lawmakers were very upset, to say the least, right, that this was something that needed to happen, but it passed out of committee. And it seems like there's bipartisan support to get this done and to make sure we close these loopholes in Connecticut that are keeping so many people who have expressed in public testimony that they want a chance, but they just need a little push. They need the basic help and resources to be able to get that done.
Speaking of that bipartisan effort, we're gonna kind of zone in on that in a second. Craig Fishbein, a state representative from Wallingford, he's a ranking Republican on the committee that advanced this bill, the State Judiciary Committee. Fishbein says he's in favor of trying to do whatever is possible in helping a recently incarcerated person reassimilate into society. Let's hear from Craig.
I was appalled at the public hearing where somebody told us that during their incarceration they had a wrong Social Security number. And when they left incarceration, they were given a 8x11 piece of paper, and they said, "This is your ID." Well, up top it says Department of Corrections. So how do you take that and go get a job? That just doesn't make sense.
So I just keep hearing how this has been bipartisan in the state. Steve Staffstrom, who's a Democratic state representative, he says much of the legislation on criminal justice reform in recent years has been, and he says that's because lawmakers wanted to move away over the past 2 decades from policies that are tough on crime, and I guess, kind of to a way that's a juvenile justice system that provides services and intervention responses for juveniles in need. Mercy, is this really a bipartisan effort? What do you think?
Oh, gosh, I get this question. So I think, we have to think about all of these issues as part of a bigger system, and certain parts of this system might be bipartisan, have bipartisan support for improvement. But I think when we think about the perception, I'm going to go back to that point of perception that I was making before. When we think about the ways we see criminal behavior in communities of color, lots of that has been driven by some scare tactics from the Republican Party specifically, right? When we think about the summers of 2020, 2021, when carjackings became the latest trend of how to scare suburban parents into wanting tougher laws on carjackings and car break-ins, right? It all came down to, all right, we're not seeing an uptick in carjackings. We're not seeing an uptick overall in car break-ins. But what we do see is an uptick in the scare tactics and the rhetoric around it. And when it comes down to it, that kind of rhetoric really makes it dangerous for youth behavior, for young people in various communities who might be doing something what I would consider and advocates around the state would consider as just kind of dumb, because when it comes down to it, young people do, and forgive me for all the young people that are listening here today, young people do dumb things. And that is the nature of youth. Right. But what we're doing is criminalizing young behavior. Things like, OK, your doors were unlocked. So instead of sending someone to prison for a number, for whatever period of time, how about we lock our doors, right? And what was done by the Republican Party was taking all these moments where it was a situation of the doors were being left unlocked and young people were getting into them, taking change and other things that might have been in the car. Doors were being left unlocked, and the Republican Party took that and said, all right, what we're going to do is launch a campaign against young people, effectively, is what it was. And if you talk
and I got to step in here because we have a break, but Mercy is making basically the ultimate point, and she's doing it for me. It's that Republicans and Democrats are more split on juvenile justice, even though they've worked together on criminal justice reform. And I got to say that in my interview with Republican Craig Fishbein, the state representative, he said there's a juvenile crime problem in Connecticut, and he pointed to an increase in motor vehicle thefts. And to kind of talk about what Mercy was talking about, there actually isn't any data, according to the University of Connecticut, the Institute of Municipal and Regional Policy, and Steve Staffstrom also told me this as well, the Democrat state representative. There's no data connecting youth to this rise in motor vehicles. It seems like it was a 2020 thing, and recently there hasn't been any data tying youth to this issue. Hey, I got to go to a break. You're listening to The Wheelhouse on Connecticut Public. You're listening to The Wheelhouse on Connecticut Public Radio. Got some great guests this morning, talking to Mercy Quay with the CT Mirror and the founder of the Narrative Project. Also have CT Mirror star Jaden Edison and James Foreman Jr. from Yale. And guys, I kind of want to continue this conversation that we're having on criminal justice. And Jaden, I'm coming to you here. I want to get into deceptive police tactics, which the legislature is also seeking to address. What do we mean by deceptive tactics, and what would the proposed bill do?
Yeah, so deceptive or coercive tactics, right, would include, lying about evidence or making false promises about something happening, or, depriving a person of their physical, needs. So I think those are things, generally speaking, what we're talking about. But what the legislature is trying to do, and again, this is a bill that last year went through the legislature but didn't make it to the Senate. If I remember correctly, didn't make it to the Senate, passed out of the House, and so made it out of committee. All those things. So this year, this bill was back, in the conversation. And so what it would do essentially, it would deem a child's admission, confession, or statement to police inadmissible in court if it was obtained through those deceptive or coercive tactics. And I think it's particularly interesting, right? Because I think, 29% of wrongful convictions in Connecticut have involved the false confession. And that's data, brought forth by the ACLU recently. And then also, I would say that, this particular bill was supported, at least the intent of the bill was supported by the Connecticut Police Chiefs Association, who did bring forth, a couple questions and concerns that I think lawmakers were sort of receptive to and took into account. But overall, this seems like, we've been talking about this for years. I mean, we've seen in recent years, right? I mean, the Central Park 5 story has come back to the forefront. I mean, we've seen the documentaries and the stories, and even in Connecticut, particular examples with, Bobby Johnson in New Haven, who was, lied to, by police and, went through, so much, going through the criminal legal system because he was 16 at the time that things happen. I mean, there is just so much, anecdotal and, again, data out there that suggests that this is continuing to, to be a problem. And so the legislature trying to address it head on this year. And again, this isn't the first time that this bill has sort of made it, to the forefront of the conversation.
Mercy, you brought this up earlier, so I want to bring you back in on this, the consequences of this, lying to deceptive kind of tactics.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because we don't let young people rent cars until they're 25. And that's because the car industry knows that youth behavior is risky, right? Until the age of 25, when your cerebral cortex is actually fully developed. Before then, you're making decisions that are risky, novelty seeking, things that are going to be relying on the way that you being perceived by your peers as a young person, right? And so if the car industry can see that there is an issue with renting out to young people, why can't the criminal justice sector really see how young people are impressionable in certain ways? And what I really love about the advocates that are working on this right now, some of whom we work with at the Narrative Project through the Connecticut Justice Alliance and Christina Caranta, what they've said has been really spot on. It's that young people want to please people in authority, right? And so if you're sitting a young person down at a table and that young person is told, listen, we already have the evidence on you. Lie number one, all we need you to do is confess. Lie number two, oh, right, you will fare a lot better if you just cooperate. Lie number three, when we're lying to young people in this way, what they're going to do is A, try to please the person in authority, but then also B, they'll trust the person in authority, because from such a young age, young people are conditioned to trust people in authority. So what we're saying at this one side of our mouths to young people is trust people in authority, trust your teachers, trust police officers. And then at the other side of the mouth, it's like, but wait, they might be deceiving you into ruining your life. And so be cautious of that. Know your rights. And it creates a lot of confusion for young people. And if adults can't navigate the system, how can we expect a 16-year-old to?
This is a very serious topic, but I can't help but think about the gentleman who's on TikTok now, this guy, Kennedy Law Firm, who's telling you these quick videos on TikTok. He's like this lawyer. I think he's from the South. I think he's got an accent. And he tells you that Kev's got you covered and the police will lie to you. So don't confess to anything without your lawyer there. So just go check out Kev's videos there on TikTok, and I think they'll help you out if you're ever in this kind of a predicament. Hey, Jaden, there's also been efforts this session to end routine strip searches in Connecticut's prisons. When does the DOC carry out strip searches right now? And what was the aim of this initial proposal from lawmakers? Because it's changed.
Yeah, so this is an extremely fascinating area, right? So first and foremost, so strip searches under the Department of Correction are carried, as you mentioned, it's in the name, routine strip searches, right? I mean, through everyday kind of, transfers, throughout the facility, coming in and out of the facility, during, while going into visits, et cetera, et cetera. And so what you're seeing is an effort, and this has been described by people who are incarcerated and grassroots organizers, particularly spearheaded by Stop Solitary CT, led by Barbara Fair, described as perhaps the most inhumane and the most, described as state-sanctioned, sexual violence, but the most inhumane thing that advocates subscribe, that happens within the Department of Correction. And so what advocates are attempting to do, and what they attempted to do this year, was to, place severe limits on when people would be strip searched in the Department of Correction. And so that effort obviously has been curtailed as of recently, because instead of, raising the standard to which a person can be strip searched from, reasonable suspicion to probable cause, and, mandating the Department of Correction and correctional officers in particular to, get permission from their supervisor to conduct a routine strip search. Now lawmakers are saying, hey, let's pull back a little bit. Let's conduct a study and let's come back and see if we can perhaps implement body scan technology in the future that could, do what this bill is intending to do. But right now we're not quite ready. And so what happened was you saw, the bill, which was severely changed from something that would have been, by all, accounts, landmark, in its intent, has changed to something which we've seen, across Connecticut, across various issues. The legislature wants to commission a study and get more information on it before they move on it. So it's a very interesting thing. But I would also note very quickly that the effort to end routine strip searches was also a part of the Landmark Protect Act, which passed last year. But throughout negotiations, it was removed. And so Stop Solitary Connecticut and the grassroots organizers had vowed to come back and to address it. And this is their effort. And this is something that's been opposed by correctional officers and the Department of Correction, who claim that, it would just open the door for more and more, drugs and illegal, things to come into the facility. Which I would also note that there are stories on the record, right, in which correctional officers have been accused of doing those very things. So just a very interesting topic, but definitely something to watch in the coming years, right? Connecticut loves to do things incrementally, and this seems like one of those things that in a few years could very much continue to be at the forefront of the conversation.
And we've had some Twitter users complain about that as well, about the some of the things that are moved into either a committee or a task force or studying it. So shout out to those listeners to paying attention to us at WNPR, at Frankie Grazi 6 on Twitter. I got to go back to James here for a second. Police deceptive tactics and also this issue of strip searches. Kind of zoom out and give us the national perspective if you can.
No, absolutely. I appreciate that. In terms of police deceptive tactics, the only thing that I would say, in addition to everything that that folks have laid out really well, is that every single time you have a wrongful conviction, that is to say, every single time that the police trick a young person into confessing and that person didn't do it, we have the travesty of that person, that young person who goes to prison unfairly. But we also have another travesty, which is somebody did this crime and they have not been arrested. So one of the things that I think we really need to be clear about is that these tactics, like lying to young people, they're not tough on crime. Because when you lie to young people and you get a false conviction, when you get a false confession and a false conviction, that means you've let somebody go who did the crime. And the people who support this kind of tactics really need to own the way their own tactics are raising crime. In terms of strip searches, I think that, this goes into one of these categories of things that happen in the prison system that are not well known to people outside of it, right? If you've been inside or if you have a loved one that's been inside, maybe if you've been a public defender like I was and you represented people who share these stories with you, you really understand some of the degradation that the system puts people through unnecessarily. And to me, this would be a really good example of it. And I'm very, saddened that the proposal got tabled to be further studied. I know that this state, and Jade mentioned this, sometimes has a history of kind of studying things for a long time, and that's fine. We need to get to the right answer, but we also need to understand that every day, every month, every year that this thing is tabled and is further studied, people are going through this degrading and harmful, degrading ritual of these strip searches. And so I think the sooner this can come back, the better, because it really needs to end.
Thank you guys for dealing with some technical issues that we had. James, a star throughout that conversation, handling that as well. Appreciate that very much. I got to say it's a wrap on our criminal justice conversation this week. This is what happened when you get Mercy and Frankie talking together on the air for a little bit. I don't get to get to everything that we want, but I absolutely loved it.
They have no idea what they were signing up for, but I hope we gave them a good show.
Mercy Quay, Jaden Edison, and James Foreman Jr., thank you so much for your commentary this week on The Wheelhouse.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for having me.
Have a great week. Thank you.
It's a wrap on criminal justice reform, but mayoral races. This is The Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. Connecticut's primary elections, they're coming up. They're not until September, but already we're seeing a lot of competition for mayor in several of Connecticut's major cities. We're going to zoom in on different mayoral races in the coming weeks and months. So we promise that. So stick tuned to the Wheelhouse in that regard. But today, we're going to start with Hartford, New Haven, and Bridgeport. Here to walk us through those races is a good friend of the show, and you're getting some monumental moments early on in the history of the Wheelhouse here, the new Wheelhouse. This is the first time Jonathan Wharton is on the new Wheelhouse.
Thank you for having me on,
morning,
Frankie.
Professor.
I've been lobbying for the show to return, so glad to be on it finally.
I know. The Associate Professor of Political Science at Urban Affairs at Southern Connecticut State University, a big reason why this show came back. Thank you so much for your support, Jonathan.
Absolutely. I also want to give a shout out to a lot of people here at Southern who love your show. I think you know that. There's so many people from the vice presidents and provost offices. So certainly to them, it means a great deal.
Thank you for coming on, Jonathan. I can't wait to get into this discussion. But before we get into some of these big races to watch, set the stage here. I got to ask you, why should our listeners care about local mayoral elections?
I get this all the time from students, as you can imagine, because the obsession has been more what's going on at the national level. And I have to constantly remind, certainly, listeners and readers and my students that it's the local politics where you see the most impact. And I'm not just saying in terms of voting or supporting, but also in terms of volunteering and donating money and time and efforts for candidates. And so they can have a real impact as it relates to schools and public safety and economic development.
Why are we seeing so many candidates start their messaging, their fundraising now? I mean, I've been trying to collect some of these candidate registration forms over the last month, and they're kind of pouring in now. Why is now the time?
This is a great time now because the advantage, especially a place like in Hartford where there are half dozen candidates, you get the name recognition started. And as a matter of fact, they really started at the beginning of the year. And I got to give credit to Hartford. They've already started doing their monthly debates among the candidates. And so it's good to get your name out there early as opposed to later. And what we're kind of seeing in Waterbury is interesting too, because, that announcement about their mayors not wanting to run again, O'Leary, it's now going to put this in an interesting tailspin for Waterbury because, we got to see who the candidates are going to be to step up now. And we probably won't hear names until maybe the end of the month or May. So it's either you start early or you wait later. And I know you mentioned the primaries obviously are in September, but we need to keep in mind that it's the endorsements and it's the local conventions that take place in July. So it's good to do it now as opposed to wait until the summer.
I want to do this part quickly. You mentioned it already. So Waterbury Mayor Neil O'Leary is what you're talking about, recently announcing he wouldn't be seeking re-election. And you talked about some of the names coming out. We got an unaffiliated candidate named Keisha Gilliams and Republican Dawn Marano, who has filed paperwork to run. And then we got Paul Pernaruski, who filed paperwork for an exploratory committee. What do you think this all means for the upcoming mayoral election? O'Leary kind of pulling his name out of the ring already.
Well, I mean, there's some gossip or talk that he might want to run for another office. I mean, of course, he was mayor for quite a while. If I remember correctly, I think 12 years. So that's certainly, a period of years. It'll be interesting to see who he'll come out to endorse. And so, of course, those candidates that you're mentioning, it's an approach in which they go out and do these exploratory committees to understand, okay, what's the likelihood or interest out there for donors and supporters if I were to run for office. So it's good to get your name out there now through doing the exploratory committees and seeing, what are the possibilities. And of course, I think you already know, Frankie, and your listeners do too, it does make a difference to get that support from the local parties.
To Bridgeport and another longtime mayor, who's going to run against the incumbent mayor, Joe Ganim?
Well, who isn't at this point, right? As a matter of fact, I didn't have a chance to tell you earlier, I had an opportunity to sit in on the recent council meeting on Monday, which was very dramatic. And it was quite interesting because both John Gomes and, Lamont Daniels were there, as well as obviously, Mayor Ganim presiding at the council meeting. And so it was very, very dramatic. It's not unusual in Bridgeport where you have candidates step up and they get involved even in some of the council meetings, which seemed to be the case, at least behind, at least out in the audience side of things. And I don't want to forget also State Senator Marilyn Moore, because of course she's running again. So these names are recognizable to some degrees, but it's also a matter of who's on which side there in Bridgeport, for or against the mayor.
What outstanding enterprise reporting by Jonathan Wharton to show up at that Bridgeport City Council meeting the other night. And you got Lamont Daniels, who you mentioned, John Gomes and Ganim that are Democrats. State Senator Marilyn Moore she's also filed paperwork. And then there's a Republican named Brashawn Thompson Baker who just entered the fray. Let's go to New Haven now. Who else aside from Mayor Justin Elicker is in that race? And can Mayor Justin Elicker win?
It's typical, Frankie, and I think you know this and your listeners do too, that no matter what the cycle, there's going to be multiple mayoral candidates in New Haven. Maybe it's just the fact that, we do, in every 2 years, and there's a big interest and a big draw. So, there are obviously several names being mentioned. Tom Goldenberg announced recently that he's running, and of course, Mayor Elicker is running again. And also, former alder Ambassador Warp is going to be running too. And then, of course, there's also a local lawyer, Liam Brennan. So, and I don't want to forget certainly John Carlson on the Republican ticket. So it's not surprising to hear about all these candidates who are going to step up and have an interest in running.
It's Elliker, then 3 Democrats named Shafiq Abdusabur, Liam Brennan, as Jonathan just mentioned, and Tom Goldenberg, and the other 2 that have filed paperwork are unaffiliated candidates named Wendy Hamilton and Macy Torres. Hartford, Mayor Luke Bronin, he's not running again. So open mayoral race, kind of like Waterbury. What do we expect to play out in Hartford?
Oh, I'm mesmerized by Hartford. Of all the mayoral races, this is
mesmerized. Love that term.
Yeah, absolutely. Because you've got so many personalities who are stepping up. I mean, former and even retired lawmakers, say Senator Eric Coleman, and certainly the current state rep John Fonfora, and then you got the council member Nick LeBron too. So, and I mean, these are just 3 names out of 6 because there are a couple of others too who are interested as well. So, and I don't even think they're done. I think we're going to see more candidates, and that's just on the Democratic side. I think you could see maybe an independent or 2, and even Working Families Party. I don't want to ignore them in all this.
Working Families Party, we know that they have membership on the council, including Tiana Hercules and Josh Michtam. Big slate of 8 people running for mayor in Hartford. Democrats Arunan Arulampalam, Eric Coleman, John Fonfara, as you mentioned earlier, Tracy Funny, Nick LeBron, who's on the city council, James McCauley, Independent Giselle Jacobs, and then there's an 8th person, Renardo Dunn Jr., who's also listed on the city clerk's website. How critical are these candidates' efforts leading up to September's primary elections versus the general, particularly in these kind of Democratic stronghold cities?
I'm glad you mentioned that, Frankie. Thank you. Great question. This is why I was stating in recent editorials that it's critical that voters engage with the primaries. The primaries in many of these cities are so important because ultimately the primaries are where the decisions can be made as to who the Democrats will choose in these city strongholds here. So, and that's key because in some of these municipalities, you're likely to get 20-25% to show up in the primaries. So it's not so much the general election that we'll see in November, it's more that primary election in September. And we need to keep in mind that we have closed primaries. So you need to have that party affiliation in order to participate in these primaries.
Could one of these cities get a woman or person of color elected to office? What do you think, Jonathan? Really quickly,
I think,
too,
Frankie,
we're
you
up
and I have
against
spoken about this, right? So is Dan Haar. Dan Haar has emphasized this over and over again that we've had a lot of white male mayors in our cities. And so
Joe Ganim, Neil O'Leary, Luke Bronin,
Justin Elliker, a number of them. And it's been this way for a while, right? Of course, you remember I've emphasized to you a lot of this is because of the Democratic machinery and the Democratic town committees. And it's not so much just the candidates who's doing the endorsing and the supporting and the donating. So, yes, I think there could be a possibility, but we'll have to see what that turnout is. We'll have to see where the donors are. And then we have a crowded field like this. How do you filter through all the candidates? I mean, that's going to be challenging for anybody.
Could be State Senator Marilyn Monroe, who ran a tough race against Joe Ganim last time. A big thanks to Jonathan Wharton for joining us on this week's Wheelhouse. Great to talk to you, buddy.
Great talking to you too, Frankie. Thank you.
I'm Frankie Graziano. Today's show was produced by Meg Dalton. Our technical producer is Dylan Reyes. Thanks to Katie Tolarski for helping us in studio. I got to thank my mother-in-law as well, Karen, for taking care of my kids so that I could do this show from home today as we play Hurt a little bit. Download the Wheelhouse anytime on your favorite podcast app. Thank you for listening. This is the Wheelhouse.